You. Welcome back, everyone, to the State Aid for School Construction Working Group. We are in the post-lunch portion of our meeting. 12:30. If you consult the agenda, you see that we are scheduled to vote on draft 2.1 at 12:30. I'm not sure that we're quite ready to do that. So what I would propose for the next half hour would be to continue the discussion we were having before lunch, see where it leads. If it takes us to a vote, that would be fabulous. And if not, we can pivot at that point in time. But we were discussing mainly that page 10, looking at subsection 5, I believe it is. The applicant has completed a facilities master planning process of that, and then we were supposed to, if we had time, to sort of do a little bit of homework looking at Title 16, Chapter 123, Section 3448, which is old language, approval and funding of school construction projects, renewable energy. That's what it's called. Then it goes into construction aid. So we could pick up there if you all feel that that's a good place to pick up. What are we thinking, team? Yes, David, Senator Weeks.
So page 10, lines 17 and 18, being that we're drafting in here some essentially elements of rules instead of allowing the AOE and this potential construction board to establish these rules. I find that on line 17, that shall gain points due to the length of time on the list. I would suggest that we remove that and allow the priorities to be priorities and not create artificial priorities, which, you know, if something doesn't make it to the top of the list, it doesn't make it to the top of the list. Don't artificially inflate it each year because it's not a priority. That's just a.
I would agree with you on that.
Right, I agree. I don't think it definitely shouldn't be shall. I mean, it may gain points because there may be more deterioration of the facility or there may be other things, but I don't think it's definitely not a shall.
That's a good point.
So I think we've charged the AOE to maintaining a relatively dynamic list of facility conditions. And if the points changed year to year, or however, whatever the periodicity that these facility priorities are established, that would change its relative priority, but not an artificial, you've been on the list near the top for a year, you get more points.
Yeah, I would move that we change the shall to may. I want to hear if Jill has an opinion on that.
Okay, so just looking at the prior program, and then what we had proposed, and there is a parallel in Rhode Island. The reason that they have and we have the priority points in every year that so you have a project that meets all of our criteria, but you were project number 10 and we can only fund 9 projects this year. And so there is a recognition that in an environment of scarcity, which is what we're going to be operating in, that there is maybe kind of a fairness to that, to say like, oh, you were number 10 this year. Oh man, you were number 10 again last year because we reran the numbers and you're coming in just under every single time. But while we're doing that, your building is continuing to get in worse condition. So it doesn't have to be 20 points every year, but the way that we had it is that you would start to accrue some priority points that over time might push you over, you know, this year you're actually number 9 and you're going to get funding. So I'm just saying there's precedent in how we did it before and in how at least Rhode Island.
To my colleague's point, though, the condition of the building, which presumably will be exacerbating year after year, it does enter into the priority scale, doesn't it?
Yeah, essentially.
So it would potentially move up on the scale just because things are deteriorating year after year.
Yeah.
Can I use a
Senator
different,
Weeks.
a different example other than a building further deteriorating? Let's say SUs decide to consolidate. That might change the points in a dramatic way, that they're actually, the communities are coming together and they're recognizing a solution. That's how you gain traction on this list, not just by being on the list last year.
Yeah.
I think that's what we need to recognize and roll forward. Real movement.
Yeah, so meeting you halfway.
Yeah.
I can see where you're going in. I could also anticipate that at least for the first 5 to 10 years, I think it will be a pretty dynamic situation.
Mhm.
And so it might be that initially we don't assign those points, but if we do have this ability to review every 5 years, what the point values might be or how we prioritize, then it could be that in 5 to 10 years, whoever makes that decision might say, okay, we've kind of moved beyond this real not emergent meaning emergency, but emergent meaning dynamics and emergent.
Yeah.
And now we can maybe get back to a cadence where we're looking at adding those points on every year. Can I phone a friend? So I have Bob.
Yeah, you can phone a friend.
And I'm wondering.
Hold on, Senator Weeks has one
Yeah.
thing to say.
So to Jill's point, because she's mentioned it now 5 or 6 times about
I have, have you noticed?
the 5-year increment.
Yeah.
I think that these rules need to be dynamic in that if they go through the rulemaking process, that they can change, not on a 5-year process, but as an as needed process. Because the experience has shown me, my observation is you draft law, you draft rules, you make mistakes. And then you got to correct those mistakes. You can't wait 5 years to correct that kind of mistake. So I hear that there needs to be a periodicity, but 5 years is a heck of a long time. And
Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sorry to interrupt, but correct me if I'm wrong, but there's nothing that would stop rulemaking from happening. We're just saying there will be a 5-year formal look at rules, correct? Someone?
I'm not sure.
Well, I was saying specifically around 2 things, that there would be a 5-year review around the points assigned for priority.
Okay.
And if we do have a bonus share aspect to this, that the percentages assigned to the state bonus share should be reviewed on a 5-year basis. The other rules, sure, I think you always have the ability to crack open rules and do a rulemaking process. I'm concerned about shifting those 2 things. I don't care if it's 5 years or 4 years, but it needs to be a length of time where it takes years to get these projects built and planned. And if we signal to the field, these are the things that we're going to prioritize, and then they start doing that and we change it 3 years later, I think we're adding chaos to the system, right? We're adding instability to the system. So on those 2 things, I would say that a 5-year cycle to me feels like the right cadence. And it could be that it gets reviewed and folks say, nope, we're staying the course. This is where we still want to be. But that's a real lever to adjust to whatever our educational transformation may be.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? So a school is assigned a point, the amount of points, right, this year. Is that the amount of points that they have throughout until they're dealt with, or are they going to be able to be reevaluated?
Yeah.
Like
This is how-
yearly?
Yeah.
To assign more points, or
That's where I wanted to phone a friend on that one, Chris. I wanted Bob's
In
opinion
the
on
old
that one.
days,
Yeah,
in the old days, it would determine whether the funding was there. Because if they were high on the priority list and they were recommended to the legislature for funding,
Mhm.
then those dollars would start going to.
yeah.
They can't physically, in the old days, you couldn't come to the legislature to say how much money was due then this next fiscal year unless they had a positive bond vote. So there's that piece that's in play as well. The district would need to vote for a bond vote. we would get a list of those in the pipeline, but it would be clear it hasn't gone to a vote yet with the
We're
district.
not sure that's the route we're taking. We're not sure that's the path we're taking right now with this.
Right, I mean, that wasn't part of the old system. You're not gonna hand out state dollars to a district unless they've had a bond vote.
Yeah, so I think though, Chris, is what you're saying though, as written,
Mhm.
says once a project receives points,
Mhm.
if it does not receive funding in a given year. So I'm making an assumption that we are talking about a project that meets all eligibility criteria, but just didn't make the cutoff for available funding in any year. So is the question, therefore, the next year, they've got to go back in the pipeline, be reevaluated?
I know,
Okay.
I know that they would remain at the level with the points that they had for the next year.
Yeah, but would they get 2 points because they just missed the cutoff through no fault of their own?
Or they may gain points, but how would they regain points? Who's gonna may gain points? How are they gonna gain those points? Who's gonna reevaluate the situation at that point? To say that they were at this level, but now they're at this level.
Yeah, so let's say they got, this is how I think it would operate, is that, let's say they got 88 points
Mhm.
in the previous year. That put them at number 10, but we could only fund 9 projects that year. They still have 88 points. And we've got a new batch coming in. But we also want to acknowledge that they're now in the queue. So do we give them 2 more points that year? Because they were number 10 last year. So now they got 90 points, but they've got it. We
Right.
might have projects that are 99 and we're not gonna not fund those.
And I agree with Senator Reed. I don't think that should be a reason that.
It hasn't changed the quality of the project.
Correct.
Gotcha.
It is what it is, right? But how do we actually know it is what it is without having another evaluation?
Yeah.
Do they still remain at that?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm articulating it
I
correctly,
don't
but
know, 'cause I don't want to get too hung up on this, but I would just move that we follow Rep. Taylor's original suggestion, which was change the shall to a may. Do folks agree with that?
I would strike it. If you're asking,
Strike it completely?
and I'm actually leaning
Is-
what Senator Weeks is at right now with the striking.
Weren't the rules kind of go more into depth, even if it's may
Yeah.
gain points?
so the
Wouldn't
point is,
rule-
why is that rule in here and every other rule is not in here?
Well, it's not a rule, that's part of the statute.
Right, but it doesn't need to be. That's my point. Why does it need to be part of the statute when it should be part of the rule? If it makes it through that whole process and becomes part of the rule, why is it in the statute? That's my point. Anyway,
Well, if you don't address it in the statute, then you don't know what the legislative intent is, and then the rules
Right,
might
so
be
I'm-
silent.
right, so you're exactly right. I agree with you 100%. And what I'm saying is it should not be part of the legislative intent, that they get extra points because they've been on the rule, on the list and not made it in the past. That's all I'm saying.
All right, and Bob, do you have anything to say at this point?
Please.
Bob upstairs.
Yeah, I guess I have a lot to say, but I'm deferring to all of you. I think there's no right answer to that. I think there's a lot of opinion and there's a lot of ways that anyone can justify what they feel on it. Conceivably, right, you could have somebody who is in the queue for a couple of years and they're getting some extra points. But then if there's somebody who's a new entry and their FCI of their building is awful and they have compelling reasons for doing other work, they could get a higher score even though someone's been in the queue. How do you balance those two compelling stories as to why they're more justified for the funding for that year? I don't know. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can look at it, and I guess we just have to figure out a way that there's a consensus around.
So suggestion. We could strike that section, starting at the once a project receives points. I would say it might come up as a proposed prioritization, right? And then that would be taken up, depending on who's making those choices, by the board or the agency or whatever it may be. Here's what I'm concerned about. I would like the opportunity to ponder the implications of that decision, So maybe we don't put it in statute, but we recognize that someone's going to be making decisions about the prioritization points, and they might decide to include it.
Yeah, that's fully.
I can live with that, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, so I do, at 1 o'clock, I do want to pivot or transition to, financing, the financing discussion. So I look to my colleagues, including Rep Brady, to see at, if there's something specific we want to talk about in the next 10 minutes. I actually wouldn't mind going back to the rulemaking discussion. I think we've had a robust conversation about rulemaking. I think I'm sort of changing my opinion to the fact that this board should be advisory for a number of reasons and not necessarily hold the authority to make rule. But I want to hear from my colleagues around the table as to how they feel about that. So maybe.
Rephrase the question.
Is how do you feel about what I just said? But what I just said was that we make the board, or whatever we're going to call it, an advisory board. So it is advisory in nature as opposed to the gatekeeper, as you like to say, around rules. That is what I'm going to propose for a number of reasons, including cost of being one. But I want to hear folks' thoughts around the table.
So what you're saying, instead of them weighing in on whether or not the agency goes forward, even imposing rules, that we take that away from the advisory board. But they wouldn't weigh in on that.
They can weigh in that they can offer suggestions or they can have an opinion, but they don't necessarily stop. They're not a red light or a green light in terms of the rules. They're advisory in nature.
And then we required of the agency to reach out to them.
Yes, we could put, that's what we could put here, and we could even have a provision where this advisory board responds in writing or something like that to the rules. So that's something that we should consider.
Where are we landing though on the prioritization points and the bonus share?
In terms of where it lives, and it lives in the mechanics of the AOE work, the work that the AOE does.
I'm just cautious about that. I mean, to me, that is like the most straightforward expression of statewide priorities. Statewide priorities, not agency priorities for the education system. But what do we collectively say are the things that we want to prioritize in the physical plant of our buildings? That it's where the rubber meets the road. It's money. It's how.
And I'm not taking this board out of the equation. I'm not saying we don't have this buy-in from folks in the state of Vermont. They're there, they're at the table.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily have the rulemaking authority. And it's not a full-time job.
I'm challenged by that, but I want to think about it.
Senator Weeks.
Sure, I'll chime in. I'll go on record as saying I think the construction board is, whether it's advisory or otherwise, is not a good use of anybody's time, and that the AOE needs to absorb full responsibility for this construction environment.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Any other thoughts? I respectfully disagree, but go ahead.
I'm not sure how I feel about the board being in existence to begin with, but if in fact this committee feels that it should be, I would lean toward it being an advisory board. I'd hesitate about who's going to have, they're going to have oversight. I know AOE, it appears strongly likes this recommendation as having, but the checks and balances, I believe, would still be there even there. If they don't like something and have a written response to, and AOE decides to move forward anyways, they still have the ability to say, well, this was our recommendation, then they chose not to follow this particular. So if the board moves forward, I'd like to see it move forward as an advisory board versus.
Right. I appreciate that, Senator Norris. And what I see happening here is that this is done in public and this is like a public comment, rebuttal or response. Which I think it's really useful because there are going to be folks who are really interested in this, y'all. Believe me, there are folks out there who have great stake and great interest in school construction. We've seen that already in our other committee and it's, I hear about it all the time. So yes, Senator Weeks.
If I can, I'm just going to piggyback on your comment about the public visibility. I think that's exactly what ICAR and LCAR process is. There is a huge investment in public visibility and input. And I don't understand why this particular topic, school construction, needs to be any different. The agency creates rules. They go through the review process. They come out the other end. Lots of folks chime in or at least have the opportunity.
I think John Gray made a really good point earlier, which is that ICAR and LCAR are primarily focused on process.
I disagree.
Adherence to process.
If I could just one short comment. So LCAR, I don't have the ICAR experience, but I have LCAR experience. It's all about reflecting back to the legislative intent. Are you answering the legislative intent? Does the proposed rule set address the legislative intent?
Thank you.
And that's the.
Thank you. Yeah, Rep. Taylor.
I see a benefit in having this board. I'm not so sure I see a benefit in having the board in perpetuity. I think at the beginning of this whole program, we're gonna need a entity like this. Right now, I'm okay with the gatekeeping. I do have to do some more thought on that for sure. And I just want to, again, or not again, but just remind everybody, this has to go to the full legislation anyways. So there's going to be a lot of input there as well. So that's my 2 cents.
Awesome. Thank you. John Gray, could I call you back to the table just to speak one more time as to what the statutorial rules are of ICAR and LCAR?
Sure. So, John Gray,
I'll be back. All right. Thanks.
I do take Senator Weeks' point that these committees are meant to look at legislative intent. More of what I meant is that the bases for objection are things like, it can be that this strays beyond the legislative intent, or that the public review process was inadequate, things along these lines. In my limited experience with LCAR, those checks are primarily procedural. You're in a deferential posture, but you can I take the point, but I do think they're procedural checks on the process. At least I'm envisioning if you set up this function with what's currently not called the advisory board, the board, having a gatekeeping function. The gatekeeping function they would have here is much more substantial than what LCAR or ICAR would have. Like, it wouldn't be checking against legislative intent. They have full discretion to say yes or no to something. So if this board had a different view as to what the state should be pursuing with its construction aid program, this board would be authorized, as currently drafted, to say yes or no to those rules in a way that LCAR, ICAR are not authorized to say no to rules. That's all that I meant by that.
Thank you for that clarity, and I apologize if I
No. I think there was a confusion around this, so I think that.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Do you want me to stay up here, or would you? You guys have like 4 minutes.
I know. Rep. Brady, I know it's a hard day for you being at work, but do you have anything that you would like to add at this point?
I hate that I missed the end of the conversation earlier this morning, but it is such a good conversation and I'm pretty torn. I like a little bit more gatekeeping, and I think there's some pretty hard political decisions ahead. And so some of the composition of that advisory board, I think I see why they should be part of the process right now. And so I worry about watering that down too much.
Representative.
But I'm kind of stuck. I'm spinning a little here too.
Thank you, Rep. Brady. Co-Chair Rick Brady.
So I'm wondering if we got a few thoughts going on here. Do away with the gatekeeping, just have it advisory, have a sunset on the board of maybe 5 years to keep the C.
But that would only be able to do that if it was strictly advisory. because
Right, just advisory.
of them having, you know,
Yeah, I mean, can I just make a comment on the 5 years? I have an issue with 5 years only because,
Could be any year.
yeah, okay.
I'm just,
Yeah, let's go further out because this is all gonna be so slow.
I just put that out. We could just have it advised.
Gotcha.
No gatekeeping and have a sunset.
Okay.
And we could also, I mean, this is all going to be a recommendation to our standing committees.
Sure.
And we could highlight some of the issues that have come before us, like gatekeeping. And we could say to them, this is an issue that the committees need to really look at. The other issue that's percolated, if a project doesn't meet the list that particular year, because there wasn't enough funding, should that project get more points? We can highlight some of these issues that we are grappling with, and we can't do a deep dive, but we can highlight this to our standing committees and say, when you're looking at the advisory committee, should there be a gatekeeping role or not? And let our standing committees really vet that. So that's what I would say. Do away with the gatekeeping, keep it an advisory, put a sunset on the advisory. And then have a side letter, whatever it is from this committee, to say, these are the issues that percolate to the top that we ask the standing committees to really vet. Plus in our limited capacity, we just didn't have the time or the expertise. Because it's a draft piece of legislation, it's gonna change. And at least if we could give some direction to our standing committee.
If we set it up right from the beginning with a sunset, are we just completely stripping it of any kind of meaningful?
teeth to it.
Yeah, I mean,
Just trying to find a way,
No, I-
but you were sort of alluding to,
No,
I was thinking of the sunset, and you kind of alluded to it.
that eventually it might not be needed.
well, eventually, the school construction program may not be needed. I'm hypothetical, okay? We fix all our schools and unicorns and rainbows, we all live happily ever after.
It'll be 20 years, so there'll be.
I'm just, you know what I'm saying? So maybe, is it one of those, like, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it kind of thing?
For
But
which piece?
but
For the sunset?
for the sunset,
Do we,
yeah,
instead of a sunset, do we put something in there where there's not a check back, but some wording in there where, you know, at some point down the road, we can,
Want that?
we need to have this program evaluated or this board evaluated to see if it was still, I don't know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say necessary, but
Does the appetite to sunset at all stem from the board currently being tasked with its gatekeeping function, which you're now intending to strip away? Or even if the rulemaking gatekeeping is removed, you still would like to sunset? I just wasn't
Well,
sure.
I'm just looking at where we are as a committee. There's some folks that don't feel we need the board at all. There's some folks that say, hey, we do need the board. There's some folks that like the gatekeeping. There's some folks that don't like the gatekeeping. So it's just trying to figure out how to move
and
this.
to me, it's not tied to that because I actually don't mind the gatekeeping being in there right now. I'm gonna do some more thought on it, but I also don't know if we need a board existing forever in this.
Right.
okay, so it's 1 o'clock. What I'm going to suggest is that we leave this as is, reminding ourselves that we are sending this to other bodies to look at for the time being. We come back at 2:15 for a committee discussion, but which isn't much time, but we are going to come back to a committee discussion. So right now, I would like us to transition to financing. And I welcome Chris Roop up to the table, and Julia, if she would like to join, but you can also stay there if you'd like. Our folks from Joint Fiscal, who will take us through the slides that Chris put together, and they are fabulous. By the way, thank you very much. And Jill had to step out until about 2. Take it away, Chris. Thank
Well,
you.
good afternoon. Hello, everyone. First of all, just thank you all for dedicating so much of your time to this super easy, challenge-free issue. I commend you all for your dedication. Some of you may not know me because I don't spend a lot of time in the education committee, unless you want to talk about teacher pensions. Chair Ammon sees me like 5 minutes a session to talk about some really obscure thing in the Capitol bill. But otherwise, I spend most of my time in the appropriations committees, Ways and Means, Finance, and every once in a while in transportation. So I'm going to go ahead and just start off by saying that if you're expecting me to find $300 million for the next 20 years, you're going to be thoroughly dissatisfied by my slides. But my goal here is I realize that if you don't spend a lot of time around the budget aspect of the legislative process, that it can feel very opaque. And what I am hoping to do here is to just kind of bring everybody to a common understanding of some of the dynamics that happen with the state finances and the budget process. So you can sort of have a common understanding, have some considerations, and think about how this will guide you as you continue to develop this bill and shepherd it through the legislative process next session. So I just want to walk over a few sort of core foundational fiscal topics. We talk a lot about money, but money is not the same all the time. Like there's a real key distinction between funding and financing. And it's sort of a good way to think of that is paying with cash or paying with credit. Funding is very straightforward. You're providing money to address an issue. So that could be the legislature making an appropriation or a grant to go do school construction, go buy widgets, whatever. Financing, on the other hand, doesn't inherently mean you're adding more money into the mix. Financing is like borrowing. You're basically advancing a future cash flow to make it available to spend today. So that's like taking out a loan, issuing a bond, which is a loan. And there's trade-offs with financing. On the one hand, you're bringing up money to spend now. And a lot of times it's cheaper, especially in construction, it's cheaper to do the work now than in the future because things are always deteriorating and costs are always going up. But financing isn't free money. You have to pay that back over time, often with interest costs. And something that we often don't talk about enough is that can sometimes limit your flexibility for how to manage your finances in future years. So I just want to give you all a couple key sort of considerations about funding and then financing. Funding, like I said, is providing money to address an issue. And some examples of that could be reallocating existing resources within your budget. You all do this all the time with the annual budgets. Taxes or fees, new taxes, higher taxes. Appropriations or grants, instead of appropriating $5 million for something in the budget, you appropriate more of that. Or, you use a refundable tax credit to bring more money into the mix. An appropriation is really, it's a long word, but what it really means is you're providing an explicit amount of spending authority available for a specific activity. So, that doesn't mean you have to have more money. It could just be you reprioritize what you have, but that's a decision that you all make every year. Would never speak for the appropriations committees, but I spend a whole lot of time in them. And I could tell you that there's a few things that they really keep in mind when they're developing the budget. And a key distinction is between what we call one-time versus base money. And one-time funds are exactly what they sound like. And you all typically strive to make sure that you're spending one-time money on one-time things and not, standing up a new program or creating an ongoing obligation with one-time money. Base funding is, this is what we do every year. We expect it's going to continue every year. So you don't want to use a one-time windfall or a surplus one year to cover base appropriations. You want to use recurring funds for that. Something else to keep in mind that often gets overlooked is this concept of stability versus volatility. We've been really fortunate for the last 15 years or so that we haven't had a major economic crisis, but not all of our revenue sources behave the same ways. So, there are certain revenue sources that are very sensitive to what's going on in the economy. Property transfer tax, personal and corporate income taxes come to mind. There are also some funding sources that tend to be very stable regardless of what's going on. And a classic case of that is the property tax. whenever you've got an ongoing commitment of funds, it's a good idea to try to have some predictability in your revenue source. And one way that, we try to manage that at the state level is by having a diversity of revenue sources going into major funds that can mitigate some of that volatility risk. Let's pivot real quick to financing. Financing, like I said, it's a tool that to advance future cash flows to make them available today. But obviously that means you have to pay back that financing with future funding. So some classic examples that you'll often see are bonds. You all have talked about this a lot. Schools can take advantage of lower tax exempt interest rates in the municipal bond market. And the Vermont Bond Bank offers a really convenient tool to allow local schools to access the bond market because, unless you're doing a really big bond issue, it can be pretty technical and cost prohibitive to go out in the market on your own. So as you heard earlier in this process, the bond bank sort of allows smaller borrowers to pool their needs into doing one, larger bond issue and get some economies of scale. I wanted to flag something for you all and just highlight it, and Chair Emmons knows this, but the state capital bill that had funded the existing school construction program is severely constrained fiscally. The Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, CDAC, just voted a couple weeks ago, actually, to lower its recommended general obligation bond limit from 54 million a year to 50 million a year for the next 2 years. So given the needs out there and what's going on with the cost of construction in general, as well as, the state's ability to get money out the gate and spend money, some of those factors have led to CDAC modifying their recommendation. This is all a way of saying that the capital bill is not going to be the place where you're going to find a whole lot of extra money lying around in order to fund school construction. Revolving loans can be an example that you see out there. It's an alternative means of borrowing, but I'm not sure how appropriate it would be in this situation. You'd have to answer some questions about where would that initial capital come from to seed a revolving loan fund? Is there an unmet credit need out there that a revolving loan fund could step in? Or, are schools able to access conventional financing? The longer the time horizon on a revolving loan fund, the slower the fund revolves, which means you can do less and have less impact with that money. And, the real advantage of the revolving loan fund model is, not only to sort of create a credit facility where one might not exist, but sometimes you can save some money based on the spread of the interest rate between what, you're paying for a revolving loan versus through the bond market. But keep in mind that the lower you keep that rate on a revolving loan fund, the less able a revolving loan fund would be to keep up with your needs long term. So, those are just some things to keep in mind that maybe that might not be the magic solution out here.
Yeah, Chris, can I do a pause?
Sure.
Check in with folks. How's everyone doing? Right. Okay, we're gonna move on to P3s, I think.
Yeah, so I put a little question mark here because this is a very unconventional strategy in the education space, but there was one recent large example in Prince George's County, Maryland. A P3, a public-private partnership, is, cryptically exactly what it sounds like. You find a private partner out there to basically get around these in the public sector doing a construction directly, and you leverage it. Deliver a project faster and under budget. But then, the private partners need to earn a return on that investment. So the way it works in Prince George's County, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, is there was a consortium of private entities out there that put forth a proposal that they could build, I think it was 6 schools, and do it pretty quickly, quicker than the county felt they could do through a conventional means. They build the schools, and then you enter into a long-term agreement where the schools are basically paying a fee to that private entity every year in order to deliver those projects and operate and maintain them for a period of time. So they don't always save money in the long run. A lot of the devil is really in the details. We can't really generalize at this point whether it would be a viable path forward, but typically when an entity is interested in seeing whether this is viable, they'll hire an advisor, they'll go through a procurement process, and they'll see, what kind of ideas does the market have out there, if any, to do this, and what are the terms? But, nothing is free. Nobody's going to come build you a school for free. So somebody needs to earn a return on investment somehow, whether that is through, a regular payment every year to that entity to operate and maintain and build that school, or, maybe you've got a whole lot of property in the public schools ownership and you want to do something around development rights on some of it. It's just, we don't know at this point. That's why people hire advisors to sort of do this stuff. But since there was an example out there and it was relatively recent, and I think Prince George's County is pursuing, if not moving forward on a phase 2. Just wanted to put that on the table as something that's bubbling up.
Thank you, Chris. And I do just want to flag briefly for the committee that I did receive a really nice document from Bob Donahue about P3s. It does a good overview. And then I also had a nice conversation with Michael Gahn from the Bond Bank, who also put together a 3-page sort of white paper on P3s. And I'm happy to share it with everyone in the committee. We've got Senator Weeks, and then we have we have Rep. Emmons and
Deferring,
then
I will.
Senator. Thank you.
So for these public-private partnerships, could a school district right now enter into one?
I don't know if they have,
Allowed?
that's a question for Ledge Council. I don't know if they have the legal authority to do that.
Curious.
There is, I know there's one example in the transportation space in Title 19 that authorizes V-Trans to enter into P3s. It is a sort of time limited, it sunsets soon. It's in 19 VSA 20, chapter 26, if anybody wants to look. I don't know if the agencies ever availed themselves of that, but there was sort of a broad enabling.
Yep. And if I could just tag on to what you just said, Chris, if we were to consider P3s, I think it would be in adding enabling language to what we're doing, and that would probably be the extent of it. So just something to consider. Senator Weed, although she's not done yet.
We do that now on state construction projects, for state buildings. They're building supposedly our new juvenile center. We call it design build. But an entity builds it,
It's very
and
similar.
then we lease it back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Senator Weeks.
So just curious to see if anybody in the room can answer this. So is this a concept that could potentially be applied to independent schools, Vermont independent schools, current or future? Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Chris. I think we're ready to, that service subsidy.
So due to the, I'm sort of cribbing from the Rhode Island model here because I know that's what you all have been looking at up to this point, and also layering in our unique system of funding education that, the sort of school debt subsidy model is a bit of a weird little hybrid between funding and financing. In this model, the school would go and borrow funds, which is financing. And then, the state would then issue a grant to those schools to pay a portion of those annual debt service costs. So they're bringing some funding into the equation to help lower that cost of financing on property tax. But, here's where our weird little funding system comes into play is that, when a school that borrows funds is certainly committing their future budgets and cash flows to paying off that debt service, but there's sort of an automatic mechanism in place through calculating the property taxes every year to pay those debt service costs. So inherently, those tax rates are being set in the future to account for the fact that debt service costs need to increase or need to be paid for. It's not like building a bridge where you're not necessarily increasing the gas tax to bring more money into the mix to pay for a bond. I mean, here it sort of automatically happens through the math.
And thank you. I wanted you to finish all these without interrupting you, but I'm sorry because I am the one who's interrupting. But I think it's one of the things we all have to sort of keep in our minds as we're doing all this work is that there is a good chance, I think, that our education financing system will look differently in the coming years. So as we're thinking about all of this, we shouldn't be too fixated on our current system.
This is just current law.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good point. That's current law. And, the end of the day, we've been talking a lot about, I know you've heard from my colleague Julia about, they're all state dollars, even though we sort of try to make that distinction between, what's in the local budget versus what, the aid program would be accomplishing. In my mind, like, I view this very simply, like the crux of the issue here you're wrestling with is how to shift some of the costs of school construction off of the property tax. So like, just put a period at the end of that. That's really what you're trying to accomplish here. So I just want to talk a little bit about the role of the budget process because, I think the budget process is really important, even if you all might not necessarily agree with everything that ever ends up in any given budget. The thing that I think is really important for you to remember is that the budget is like the primary tool that the legislature has to set priorities. So it is really important to be mindful of how priorities interact with the annual budget process. So just to quickly rehash things, we talk a lot about the big bill. The big bill is the annual appropriations bill for the upcoming fiscal year. And that bill they call it the big bill for a reason. It includes a lot of things, base appropriations, one-time appropriations, and transfers from one fund to another fund. It also includes lots of explanatory directive language about what the executive branch needs to do with those appropriations. So the governor recommends a budget each January for the upcoming fiscal year. We call that the GovRec. It's typically done before the end of January per statute. The legislature then passes that in May. It's usually the last bill you all vote on before you get out of here. There are other bills out there like the capital bill and the T-bill. Those authorize projects. Those say you're allowed to spend X amount doing this, but they don't actually provide the spending authority to fund them. That's where the budget comes into play. So the capital bill will put a big list of projects together, but at the end of the day, you need the budget to fund the debt service on the bond in order to fund the projects that are authorized in the capital bill.
They authorize the legislature.
The legislature authorizes the executive branch. They approve the project.
Right.
One thing I really just want to underscore is between the time the GovRec is presented and the time it's passed, a lot of things change. But that doesn't always represent differences of opinion. Sometimes it does, but sometimes information evolves over time. So a lot can change. We get between the preparation of the GovRec and the January revenue forecast, the BAA that is passed might make changes that materially impact how much money is available to do the full big bill next year. So it's a very dynamic process that really is changing all the way down to the very end of the legislative session. And the other two points I wanted to make is the other big budget bill you all deal with is the BAA, the Budget Adjustment Act. It's typically one of the first bills that passes in the session. And that is an opportunity to amend the current year's big bill mid-fiscal year. You have another bite at the apple when you pass next year's big bill, because there's an entire section that will make changes to the current year's budget, as well as set forth next year's budget. And then at the end of the fiscal year, you might appropriate $100 and $99 gets spent. There is then a decision to be made about what to do with that dollar that wasn't spent. So that dollar can either carry forward into next year and be available for the same intended purpose, or it can be reverted back to the fund that it came from and made available for reappropriation by the legislature. If you revert an appropriation, it's no longer available to a department to spend until the legislature reappropriates that money. So that's what happens when fiscal year closes. And then the yield bill, which some of you are probably very familiar with, that's the bill every year that passes typically right before the big bill. And that's what sets the property tax rates for the upcoming year at a level that's sufficient to fund the demands placed on the education fund. But the yield bill doesn't typically make appropriations itself. There's a very good reason why a lot of appropriations try to go in the big bill. And it's so there is one place that has a full accounting of all the bills that are spending money and raising revenue. And that enables the legislature to effectively set priorities. So I did want to take a minute here to just talk about this concept of dedicated revenues And this is a topic that I frequently have to talk about around the building. So, you know, it's not unique to the school construction issue. Anybody who's championing or advocating for anything often voices a desire to use quote unquote dedicated revenues to fund that thing that they're hoping to see. But you all as legislators, and it's my job to sort of remind you of the big picture, you all should think carefully before doing explicit dedications of revenue for specific projects. The dedicated revenues often don't keep up with the needs of the programs they fund. We're seeing this big time in the judiciary, where a lot of their operations are funded on fees and surcharges on violations. And when that goes down, revenues go down, but your needs don't necessarily go down. So therefore, dedicating revenues can directly subject a program to fiscal risk, especially if those revenue sources are volatile or they're not keeping up with your expectations. Dedicated revenues also, and this goes back to the legislative role here in the appropriations process, sometimes when you dedicate revenues to something, it creates distance between that program and the appropriations process. And that's not always helpful because it can hinder the legislature's ability to assess and set priorities. And it can also hinder a program's ability to make its case for more money. Sometimes whenever there's sort of a dedicated revenue source happening in the interest of time, it's easier for legislators to sort of quote unquote set it and forget it and not pay a whole lot of attention to it along with everything else they're trying to balance. You know, the effect of dedicating revenues is prioritizing one thing above everything else. That may sound very appealing, but it can also hinder the legislature's ability to manage the state's finances in response to evolving conditions. And this can be really important when you're in a period of economic uncertainty or struggle where it's really important to try to manage the budget. And I'm saying this partially out of self-serving interest, but I want to mention it to you all too, that when you dedicate revenues, it's a little, you know, you divide up revenues and send them to special funds automatically. That's pretty administratively burdensome from an accounting and revenue forecasting perspective. You know, the tax department and finance and management need to figure out, oh, how much money do I need to transfer from one fund to another on a regular basis? And our consensus revenue forecast that, you know, we base everything around looks at the funds going into the revenues going into the major funds of state government, the T fund, the ed fund, and the general fund. It doesn't include like really little dedicated revenue streams that go to random pots of money. So perhaps there are other ways to provide stable, ongoing funding while avoiding some of those drawbacks.
Awesome. Quick check-in with the group. How are we doing? Okay.
Now, having said that, because, you know, I have to caveat everything in the fiscal world because like every principle has an exception, that there are some times where dedicated revenue does make sense. So sometimes where there's a nexus between a fee for service and who pays and who benefits. So, you know, if I buy a fishing license and it goes to a dedicated fund at Fish and Wildlife, that's kind of a no-brainer. It makes sense. Sometimes things come up where we have long-term needs, like regulatory mandates we need to comply with, like the Clean Water Fund. And it could be advantageous to say, we've got a long-term plan to deal with this, and this is how we're going to do it. And like, these are the funds that we're going to put here. And, you know, sometimes that makes a lot of sense. And to sort of dovetail into the capital budget world, you know, that's funded by general obligation funds, which is backed up by the full faith and credit of the state to raise the revenue to pay for it. There are other situations where it might make sense to use dedicated funds for non-geo borrowing. We call those revenue bonds or special obligation bonds. And like a classic example of that is the TIB bonds in the transportation space, where we have a system set up where should the state issue more TIB bonds, a certain assessment on gas and diesel first goes to paying off that debt service before it's then available for other things.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, it's the cannabis revenue too was interesting in that it had dedicated funds for after school. Because they kind of predicted that that could be a way to sort of stem some of the issues that could arise from the sale of cannabis. So yeah, thanks for that overview.
So there's, this kind of dovetails to the draft you all were looking at this morning. One option could be, and this is sort of a placeholder for your discussions, is, regardless of where the money comes from to fund the state school construction aid, you should think through some budgetary mechanics. And, this seems like a good place where it might make sense to create a special fund as an accounting mechanism to manage the funds for the program. And the draft you saw does this, but also retain interest on those funds within the program, because by default, the interest would accrue to the general fund. And the way this would work is if you create a special fund, the big bill could then be the avenue through which you appropriate funds to support the money going out to schools. And you would also transfer potentially money from, one pot of, a general fund, for example, into that special fund. So the big bill would be where you put the money into the special fund and where you stipulate how it goes out. An advantage, there's over 300 special funds. There's a lot, they're not all active. But, a key benefit of having a special fund is that it puts some guardrails around intended uses and provides some accounting transparency. So, as I just mentioned, the big bill shows the inflows and outflows every year. And every November, the Joint Fiscal Committee gets a report that shows what went in, what went out, and what was the year-end balance for all of the special funds. It is a fascinating report. And you all, as legislators, would have the ability to define the allowable uses for that special fund. The question of where will the money come from would need to be resolved at some point. But creating a special fund now does not bind any of you to one strategy or another with how to get money into that special fund. Some potential options could be transfers from other funds from existing revenues, transfers from other funds from new revenues in a fixed amount each year. You could do contingent transfers of year-end revenue surpluses. Most years in the budget, there will be a whole section that says if we have extra money at fiscal year close, these things need to get funded in priority order. And why that is there is because we don't typically have a really clear case of how the general fund is going to trend toward the end of the year till the very end of the legislative session. Because April is the biggest month for our personal income taxes. We don't get those collections until the first week of May. So that's when we start getting a good sense of whether we're going to be hot or cold, and we can start ballparking how much one way or the other. But that is another avenue for the legislature to fund some other priorities by using some sort of unexpected one-time money that might materialize. And I, see prior slide about the considerations around dedicating revenue sources directly to a special fund. So how to get money in there is ultimately a legislative decision, and the details are going to depend on where that money comes from. And what I mean when I say that is, if you all made a decision to fund this program through existing general funds, probably makes sense to just add a transfer in the budget every year of, X amount of money is being transferred from the general fund to the special fund each year. It could be a minimum amount that's set in statute to add some predictability, or it could be a dynamic number that changes every year based on budget needs, or both. One example would be if the legislature decided to raise new revenue by, for example, broadening the sales tax. It might make sense to transfer the equivalent dollar amount that broadening would raise from the ed fund to the special fund in the budget each year, rather than trying to parse all of the sales tax returns to figure out how much money did this thing raise and then do it all on the back end. On the other hand, if the General Assembly were to raise money by, increasing the personal income tax, it might make sense to do a transfer in that somewhat equivalent dollar amount from the general fund to the special fund. Long way of saying that a lot of this is going to depend on where the money comes from in terms of what is the most appropriate way to have that money flow. So these are just two quick little examples I just pulled out of statute. This is the definition of a special fund. It's not very cryptic. I'm not going to read it, but it's an accounting mechanism you have revenues going in, and it's to fund a specific purpose or activity. And one example that was relatively recent that I thought was analogous to this conversation is A few years back, a new special fund was created called the Technology Modernization Special Fund. And that fund doesn't have its own revenue source. You all in the budget will transfer money into that fund. That fund then holds that money and is used to pay for IT projects that tend to have expenses that occur over a long period of time. And that's why I felt that was kind of analogous to your current situation. So I have just a few slides here that will, raise some really maddening questions for you all to consider. Some of these I think you're already getting to through your discussion through the bill draft, but I just wanted to raise a few others to keep them in front of mind is, how will school construction aid interact with that annual budget process? I can't stress this enough, that it is, if you all want long-term success in funding this as a priority, it is vitally important to have a funding request come to the legislature at the front end of the budget development process, when the GovRec is being developed. And caveat that none of these considerations are coming at you through a political lens. This is purely procedural. It is much harder to add $20 million into the budget once it's already been developed than it is to have a budget proposal developed that accounts for that expenditure on the front end. You should think about how will the program administration costs be funded? Would those also come out of the special fund, the general fund, or some other funding source? Exactly what activities would you envision the special fund paying for? I think the debt service subsidy grants are kind of a no-brainer, but what about planning grants? What about admin? Are there other things that are thematically related to this initiative that this should also be paying for?
Sorry to interrupt again.
No, sure.
Someone who didn't want to interrupt. Planning grants, other things. Can we flesh that out a little bit, or we can wait till the end and?
No, I'm raising that as an open question for you all to consider. It's one thing to put money in to just fund grants to schools, but what about the lead up work to that? And what about paying for the FTEs that might be needed to run the program? Is a question about how you fund it and out of what pocket. Who administers it? And should they be the entity that issues rules for how the special fund is used? I think your current draft has AOE as the entity that manages the special fund. And then what, if any, role would the legislature have in officially authorizing specific projects? So when I wrote this bullet point, I wasn't coming at this from the lens of should the legislature be picking and choosing the priority list. Rather, it is what details should come to the legislature and in what form, along with that funding request about like who's funding what. So, Chair Emmons in her capital bill authorizes a list of very specific projects, specific amounts. But in the budget development process in the administration, they're taking first crack at doing sort of the prioritization. They can disagree, but, I'm not trying to suggest that the legislature should be the ones that are evaluating specific projects. But does it make sense? And if so, in what vehicle for you all to look at? Like, if we're being asked to find 20 million, 50 million, whatever, where is that money going?
So Representative Emmons.
If I could just say how it used to be in the capital bill, there'd be a line item in the capital bill of say $10 million. And that's what we would see. And it wasn't until we asked for the Agency of Education or the school construction folks within the agency at that time to come before us in testimony, and they had the list and they would give it to us in testimony. So in the governor's recommend, the list of schools was not listed, just the lump sum for that fiscal year that we were obligated to pay. So that's how the logistics of it worked. Follow that?
So was it in the GovRec bill?
What came through on the governor's capital budget was a line item for school construction,
Okay.
and the amount was 10 million. But it wasn't broken down in terms of where it went. That was from bringing in the agency and going through the list. That's how we received what schools.
It sounds like we're contemplating something kind of similar to that, so.
And I think that the state does. where your state dollars are going to what schools, because our colleagues will ask us.
Yeah. Yeah.
They'll ask, so you need to have that list in front of you.
Okay.
And another example is, you know, in the transportation world, every year, the Agency of Transportation puts forth a big book that's called the White Book. For obvious reasons, if you see it, and it is just hundreds of pages of projects that would be funded through next year's budget. And in my time here, the legislature has never not funded certain projects over others because those projects already went through a prioritization process. So you get the book, you're like, all right, this is what it all is. And then it's up to you to officially authorize those projects. Sometimes you have to change a few things, often in consultation with the administration, but it's rarely here. You rarely see political priorities enter the equation. I don't know if that was always the case, but that's the way it is now. And it's probably for the best.
Agreed.
Bill operates a little different.
So just a few other considerations that you all should keep in mind is, you know, should you fund grant awards in full upfront? And what I mean by that is, you know, if a school is going to get $20 million of debt service subsidy paid out over a 20-year period, the legislature would fund all $20 million up front, put it in that special fund, let it earn interest, and then every year you make a payment out of it. That guarantees that there's some money up there and that the school entity knows that their grant is paid for and gives them some certainty and could avoid a situation where you have a really big unfunded backlog of projects that were approved but not funded. And that seems to be what had happened under the old system where projects were being approved, but the funding didn't materialize for many years down the road. That does maximize the interest earnings potential over time if you have a larger balance in the special fund, which might help the sustainability of the program. But, you know, that does constrain the volume of new grants that you can issue each year based on the availability of funds. However, that could be advantageous too. Because if you approve too many funds at the same time, even if the construction industry can get all those projects online at the same time, that's obviously going to have an impact on property tax rates. So the alternative would be funding grant awards more on a cash basis. So in my example of the $20 million grant award paid out over 20 years, this would mean you budget $1 million each year for the next 20 years just to pay for each year's upcoming payment. Obviously, there's potential there to fund a greater number of projects initially, but that does create a long-term funding commitment that will constrain future budgets and future legislators for decades in this funding. Because if you've got schools borrowing with 20-year amortization periods, you know, the state could be committed to finding money every year for the next 20 years to honor those commitments. There's also obviously less potential to earn interest income in that special fund if the balance in that special fund is lower, and it's, you know, rather than funding the whole award and then dribbling it out over 20 years, you're just funding each year's payment and that money is going out the gate, you know, pretty quickly. You know, I already mentioned that if you have a large volume of construction projects undertaken in the near term, that will put more upward pressure on property taxes statewide when all else is equal, including under current law, if that stays equal. But, you know, construction costs more over time. Delays, deferrals, and lack of maintenance all do have real fiscal impacts. So it's complicated. And unfortunately, there's no obvious magic way to miraculously raise $300 million a year without very difficult choices. If you don't believe me, I posted the charts at the very end here from the last consensus revenue forecast from July. And this just shows you all of the revenue sources that are available to the general fund under current law. And there's another tab that shows you for the education fund, just to give you some perspective as to what we currently raise money from, how much it moves the needle, and what our rates of growth are likely to be. There's a few links there to other documents if you want to take a look in your own time to access the full revenue forecast, or our publication Fiscal Facts that walks you all through a lot of detail about what we tax, where we get money. And, if you were to raise things by, 1 cent or 1%, what would be sort of the back of the envelope, preliminary estimate of how much marginal revenue. So that's all I got.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. It was really great.
Just in millions.
These are in millions.
Okay.
Yep. Representative Emmons.
So I want to go back to, that's fine, that's fine. Your example of 20 million for one school for debt service subsidy.
Okay.
How and where do we determine, are we picking up the full debt load for that school district? Or are we picking up of that? In the old days, we picked up whatever their state grant, whatever their state aid was, which was 30%, we would pay for what was our share.
So that is an open question for you all to decide. That 20 million example does not contemplate paying the full amount. That would, because I wouldn't want to suggest that you can build a school for $20 million. But
That's their
you know,
interest cost.
the amount would be, or it would be a percentage of the annual amortization payments. So it wouldn't necessarily just be the interest or just the principal. It would be, if your annual debt service cost is, $1 million a year, the state might chip in 300,000, the state from non-property tax revenues might chip in 300,000 for a 30% cost share. And then the school district might have to fund the remaining 700,000 through its budgets.
So my brain goes, what if they're building a tennis court? What if they're building a swimming pool? Is that something we want state dollars to go towards? Even though we might be paying part of their
You want to
debt.
define the eligible costs.
Right, you gotta define what's eligible.
Yeah, and I think that's the job of the AOE, the eligibility and the prioritization, as well as bonus points. And I saw Bob just pop up on the screen. Bob, did you have something to say to that?
Well, I think that's covered also. There are eligible, and when you go through the construction planning guide, they go through what are eligible costs and what are partially eligible costs, and they prorate things that are not fully thought to be a cost that the state should bear. So that's a good point.
Yeah, we've often said we're not building Taj Mahals, right? We're, okay, right, so. Okay, so how are we doing here? 1:45. At 2:15, we have a committee discussion. Anyone want to address anything in this presentation? So if we go back to, sorry, I should pause after I ask that question.
I just want to, so if we establish a special fund, right? We could establish a special fund, but then still use the debt service subsidy model, but use a special fund for the grants, correct?
Exactly. So the special fund would be the budgetary mechanism that the state would then appropriate those grants to the school from.
But we have to fund the special.
Yeah, no,
Exactly.
absolutely. Gotta put the money in there first.
So our bill would propose that we establish a special fund. And the
So that's what we
parameters
have.
around that, but it's just dependent whenever we can have a fund, and we can also make a recommendation that for the special fund, that it comes in as the governor's recommend.
That's what I would suggest. And it is in this current draft on page 7, section 3, there is the school construction aid special fund. So this bill does contemplate the creation of a special fund. I would agree with Rep. Emmons, it needs to come in as a gov rec for sure. Yes, Senator Weeks.
Again, just kind of a curiosity question. So the January governor's recommendation is budget. Who typically provides input for a topic like this? Would it be AOE direct to the?
Yeah, so there is a internal process that begins in the fall where Department of Finance and Management works with all the executive branch agencies, and they send out budget instructions. And they give you parameters around how you build your next year's proposed budget. And they might say, build it within, with a 3% growth scenario in mind. And, we'll internal service fund increases or whatever might or might not be part of that. Once you submit those, responses to finance and management, they then have a process where they have discussions with, the agencies and entities receiving the money or hoping to receive the money. And then, they figure out priorities and they sort of define what we colloquially call the box. The box is the amount of money you have. And then they figure out what can fit in the box, how much room is in the box. And then, that comes to you all.
Okay, thank you. So,
Good, thank you. It's kind of a leading question. So my real question is maybe addressed to Bob. Is AOE intending to establish any sort of request into the January 2025 governor's recommendation for school construction purposes?
I'm not privy to those conversations, but I know Jill has mentioned she and Zoe and others have been thinking about that, and I'm sure that there will be some sort
That's
of.
fair.
Yeah.
Thank you.
thanks, Bob. Bob, did you have anything else to add at this point?
Just one, Chris, that was an awesome presentation. I really appreciated how well it clarified quite a few things for me. One question on the bonding part where you say the state general obligation bonding, CDAC lowered its recommendations to 50 million. That's for total state bonding. So if school construction was to have some sort of bonding element of that.
That's for general obligation bonds. So that's for the capital bill.
Okay.
Individual schools are not included in that. They can borrow directly through the bond bank or on their own if they wanted to, I believe. But
Okay.
it's sort of very narrowly focused on
State projects.
on state, it's primarily state projects, overwhelmingly funded by the general fund.
Okay. All right. But then any additional bonding that the schools would engage in, does that impact the credit rating that perhaps CDAC?
It is not, it's not subject to the $50 million
Okay.
cap.
Okay.
That really is what shapes the state's capital bill.
Okay.
It
Thank you.
would play in, I believe, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would play in to looking at our overall debt as a state and how that plays into the credit, how our credit rating is with our credit agencies.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And one of the things CDAC really looks at, and to hear more about it, you should really talk to the state treasurer, but CDAC does evaluate, what are the things that the rating agencies look at when assessing Vermont's credit rating and assessing our bond rating. And not only do they look at, sort of total debt outstanding that's supported by tax revenue, but they look at what is our unfunded and debt liabilities. And those vastly exceed our outstanding state GO debt. But the bond banks sort of operate, and the schools that directly borrow go through a process that's separate from that $50 million limitation from CDAC, but they certainly do consider the big picture.
Yeah, and I know Senator Weeks has a question, but I just wanted to chime in from my limited experience in Burlington. We had to look at our bond rating as a city when we were going through our construction project. And it does seem a little bit like an art form, because the question was, well, how's this going to affect our bond rating when we build this high school? But the other question was, how is it going to affect our bond rating to not have a high school? So all of these things have to be considered when thinking about these ratings. Because having the biggest city in the state of Vermont not have a high school is problematic as well. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Absolutely, it is. There is some art to it. It's not all science. And I sort of view the bond rating as it's one of those things that it's really hard to build back once you lose it. So it's really important to try to keep and maintain the rating you have.
Exactly. Yeah. Senator Weeks, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. So just a curiosity question. So you outlined the capital budgets bond limit or recommendation being reduced to 50 million. Can you give a sense of another large pool such as transportation bonding? Is that where is that? Is it like 100 million recommended limit? Is it 200 million?
So yeah, that's a great question. CDAC does not explicitly put a recommendation on transportation bonding. We have no outstanding transportation bonds other than a tiny sliver of general obligation bonds that go back from like 2009 and it's going to be fully paid off, I believe, in 2029. And we're talking like a couple $100,000 a year of debt service. We fund our transportation currently on a pay-as-you-go basis, but we do have the ability to issue more special obligation transportation infrastructure bonds if we need to. The amount we can borrow from those is dictated by how much revenue is expected to come in from the dedicated assessments on tax and diesel. So we typically, I think it was our funding policy to maintain a 3-to-1 coverage ratio to make sure that the credit rating agencies would view those as pretty low risk bonds and that we would always be able to pay them. But it's dictated by how much revenue is in the mix in order to pay those. It's probably the difference.
Very helpful.
Julia, do you have anything to add at this point?
No, I'm just here in case there's any.
Thank
I
you.
should also recognize that my colleague Pat Titterton graciously joined in case you all threw any curveballs that neither Julia nor I could answer.
And
Please throw him a curveball.
let's see, what could a curveball be?
Yeah, really.
I guess my only potential curveball would be, do you have any, and I don't, yeah, you can probably share your opinions. Do you have any sort of gut, sort of visceral reactions to talking about P3s in this context of school construction?
I have no experience with
No,
this.
okay. Good, great. That's easy then. Easy answer. Okay, any other questions regarding financing or regarding the special fund that we do have in this current draft of the bill? I guess my question is, do we need to make explicit the gov rec portion of? We do, okay, okay, because it's not currently in there. Great, so is this the moment where I would invite John back up to do some editing? Does that make sense, or do you want to stay there? You want to stay?
Whatever you guys prefer.
Okay, Chris, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Fantastic.
So, John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel, I think the proposed addition of the gov rec would go to the approval and funding section rather than the special fund section. So I think that's section 4 of the bill, which is 34.5.
Okay.
But I think that would naturally slot in where in existing law, we currently have spelled out the state board, speaks to the institution committees with its budget request. You could replace that section with something like a request for that the Agency of Education submits its proposal as part of the GovRec or something along those lines is what I'm hearing, I think.
Yeah, I think that's what you're hearing. Yeah.
And should we, this is maybe direction that we give our standing committees to look at what the special fund could be used for. And I'm thinking, does it pay for the debt service? Or if it does pay for the debt service, how do you quantify what is eligible? I mean, that kind of, because the language here doesn't talk about what the dollars in the special fund may be used for. Only sets up the fund. And instead of us spending time,
Yeah, I think
figure it
that's,
out, send the side letter to the ed committees, and say these are some of the items that maybe the fund could pay for.
I think that's a good question.
Might free up our time a little.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. How do you all feel about that? Looking at our GFO folks, JFO folks.
I think that makes a lot of sense. That was one of the considerations on one of those last slides. It's like, to what extent should parameters be specified about eligible uses for the special fund? So it could be grants to schools for debt school construction, debt service subsidies. It could be program administration. It could be some sort of planning grant on the front end to help schools develop their, do the front end work in order to apply for funding. It's really up to you all to do that.
And we could list that out
Yeah.
in a side letter and say, these are some of the places that you might want to look at,
Okay, and
just to help direct the conversation.
just for clarity, would that live in this Bill?
So here at the, we're on the bottom of page 7. This is setting up a special fund, assuming it's the structure that you wanted. And the sole prescriptive language we have here is that monies in the fund shall be used for the purpose of providing state school construction aid as prescribed in this chapter. So if elsewhere in the chapter, you set out what you would like the scope of that to be, it would cover it, but it would be easy enough in this section to say exactly what you would like this to go to. So if you're concerned that this might go to grant planning, grants for planning purposes, then you would want to spell out that it's not meant to go to that, or to specify that it's only to go to actual awards of aid to pay that debt service subsidy. So I think in constructing the special fund, if that's the structure that you want, you do need to give the parameters. This is the natural space to do that.
Can I ask a question of Bob Donahue, actually? Bob, are you already kind of doing some of the, and when I say you, I mean the AOE, is the AOE already kind of working with districts and supervisory unions on the planning portion of the work, or no?
No, not actively. Everybody's aware that a planning grant was put through legislation, but remains unfunded as of yet. But people are already talking to architectural and engineering consultants already in preparation for doing some sort of master planning for the SU.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
It may be helpful to note that, as spelled out in the draft, one of the eligibility conditions that was added today was a requirement that the applicant have gone through a planning process, and I can pull up that language again. But if you're making that an eligibility condition, perhaps that factors into the thinking as to where you would like funds to go. That.
Any thoughts from this esteemed group in terms of planning grants?
What you see up here, if you're just looking for something to think on as you debate the question, this is we're at the top of page 10. This is the final eligibility condition.
So the way you've got it structured implies that any money from the cash fund would go for planning at the district level.
It doesn't really say, it's kind of, I would call it ambiguous language, is what's currently set up in the special fund. It says for state construction aid, which feasibly would encompass that.
Right.
But it's not clear as to which. I would suggest changing this no matter which direction you would like to go, to be clear as to what specific purposes, and if there are purposes you don't want that money to go to, make it clear that it can't fall into that category. So if you did not want funds to go to grant planning, I would read under the current language that it feasibly could be considered part.
Did we do that with the old school construction formula? I can't remember if we paid, if that was part of the 30%.
I can flip to the statute if,
Trying to think we paid. I don't think we did.
see if I can find that.
And
I don't remember.
can I just, it's 2:00. Can I just make a suggestion as well? Because I feel like we're maybe running out of steam a little bit. There's been a lot coming at us. We are authorized for compensation for 6 meetings, but we are allowed to have up to 10. So I am wondering if the best course of action right now is to have our meeting on the 25th with the thinking that we might need one extra virtual meeting after that. Do people feel comfortable with that? Okay. Great. Because I'm feeling like, yeah, we had some great conversations today. It's not quite fully fleshed out. So I think we need to all kind of do some thinking in the interim and maybe have some conversations. Okay.
So we didn't pay. No, we didn't pay for planning at all. Yeah.
I hesitate to say definitively because it may have been something that fell outside the scope of this statute, but this is your 3448, which spells out that approval process, your funding, and here's what's set out for your eligible construction costs, which doesn't contain grants for planning, but it could be that it falls elsewhere.
I kind of feel as though we need to contemplate planning only because we are potentially contemplating the coalescence of like disparate districts and supervisory unions, and we're kind of thinking of a whole new structure. So I think there needs to be room for some assistance in this like kind of new world, potentially new world in landscape. Whereas I think before, correct me if I'm wrong, Rep. Emmons, but we were really kind of working within the confines of the system that existed. Whereas I think we're trying to like,
But I'm just curious if we did already pay for it, because I know on some other entities we do pay
okay,
for planning. I just couldn't remember if we did that.
but it looks like no.
It looks like we did.
Okay.
But we do use state dollars elsewhere for planning.
Right. Just hypothetically, is that something that we could task JFO with, like helping us sort of create or define what inside the special fund, what the meat of the special fund might look like?
I mean, we're happy to support the committee however they like. Just need is a sense of like, I think we're gonna need some direction about whether, like, from some of this sort of a policy decision about like, to what extent should sort of non-debt service costs be funded by the state? And then is this where we also want them to be competing for the same dollars as the debt service subsidy? So it just kind of seems like maybe a no-brainer would be, you know, I'm just doing this off the top of my head. To the extent any planning you might want to support, maybe program administration costs, like if you need to fund bodies to run this program at the state level. And obviously the debt service subsidy grants themselves to the schools. Nothing else immediately comes to mind unless the agency has other things I'm not thinking of, but this is also something that can be an evolving area of conversation.
Sure.
At the very least, I think creating a special fund gives you all a placeholder to advance those conversations.
Yeah.
Because we're not saying we're just gonna do debt service. Could be a lot of other things.
Right.
And that's why I'm just wondering if it wouldn't be. If we should try to flesh that out for our next draft
I think so.
or leave that up to our standing committees.
I think we should offer up a suggestion and then they obviously can take it or leave it or change it. But I think it would be nice for us to offer a suggestion. And I see Bob has his hand up. Okay, Bob.
Yeah, okay, I was doing some searching while you were all talking, and if I could share the screen for a minute, I can show you what the eligible costs were. That kind of address some of the
Okay,
questions.
super.
Okay,
Thanks, Bob.
yes. Oh, I think I have to be given authority to be a presenter.
You should be able to share your screen now, Bob.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so tell me when you can see. Can you see that there?
Got it. It could be a little bigger.
Okay,
Maybe.
yeah. That good?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. That's perfect.
Okay.
You'll have to scroll it up.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'll do that. Yep, for sure. Okay, so costs are eligible for the construction aid, you can see under two, legal, architectural, and engineering services. So that may not have been specifically at that time. I don't think there was any requirement for a master planning grant or master planning plan, but they did pay for the A&E service fees and design fees. So we could easily extrapolate that out to the planning if we so chose, I would think. And then you were asking, we want to make sure that we're not funding things that shouldn't be funded. And then here it lists all the partially eligible costs, being swimming pools, skating rinks, and the like. So this is in the actual Vermont construction planning guide, and it's not in the rules. But if you want, I can send you these pages from the planning guide if it helps inform discussions around what might constitute eligible costs.
Yep, Bob, can I ask you what is this document that you're showing us?
Yeah, so this is what's known as the Vermont School Construction Planning Guide.
Great.
And it basically was a book that everybody had access to that gave them kind of recommendations as how to proceed through a school construction project. And this contains the capital outlay financing formula, the minimum and maximum square footage tables that are used in generating what would be the max for state participation number. And it also touches upon all the various sister agencies that would be involved if it was a new build. You had all the various other concerns to think about in terms of wastewater treatment, Act 250, historic preservation, Department of Agriculture. So it actually gave everybody a feel of, or gave them the information that they had to be contacting all these other agencies as they went through the process of developing a school construction project. So this is one of the documents that, as part of the new construction program, we would recommend get totally revamped because everything has changed since then. A big part of it being the capital outlay financing formula.
So Bob, that's dated, the one I have is dated 2008. Is that the one that you're working off of?
Yeah, the
That's
one
the
I'm working
latest
off of, I've updated it just to reflect the current State Board of Education members. Zoe is the interim Secretary of Education. And then particularly around the unit cost construction analysis that we did when I first came on. So the unit cost table for construction has been updated just to reflect current construction sector pricing.
Right, awesome. Okay, and just for clarification with our group here, this is not rule. This is not an APA document, so this is more like policies or even like procedures, correct?
This is all just really a step-by-step guide to help schools go through the construction process with all the recommendations that were existing at this point in time in terms of getting a clerk of works, in terms of contacting all those sister agencies appropriately, and then going through how the calculations for the maximum cost for state participation actually are derived.
Okay.
Yep. So I'll send this over to you and you can, use it as you see fit.
Yeah, there's a lot, like one, it's public building requirements, then they have to comply with rules for that, construction management. Suggested procedures for school boards in terms of the chronology of going through a project, that's what's on this.
Mhm.
So it would list a reflection of what rules would be in place.
Right. Yeah.
For that.
Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Bob.
Yes, welcome.
So getting back to the special fund. And Alice, your very good questions around and really around having JFO sort of help us craft the specifics of this portion of the bill, around planning, grants, program administration, and if whether or not we're focusing on debt services as the way to provide assistance to districts, or let's say LEAs. I like LEAs.
And that stands for local educational
Agency.
agency.
All right, so it sounds like that will be some directions that we're giving to JFO to work on for next meeting. John, do you need any other guidance in terms of this particular draft?
So, if we're gonna get as far as we get,
Yeah.
if people had thoughts on spelling out the end of what's currently section 3, section 34, sorry, section 4, the approval and funding process. I noted that I just had subsection and subdivision headings at the end of that section that are not filled out with any content. Be great if, you don't have to do this, but if you want to look at how you would like the final approval process to happen, eligible construction costs, some of what we were just talking about, if funds should be refunded upon sale of a project in the future. Those sort of technical details, you don't have to spend your time on these pieces, but that is what is left in purely placeholder form in the current section. And then as a whole, this section is meant to fit into a full chapter. There are remaining pieces of chapter 123 that we haven't touched on. I don't think we are going to have the time to touch on those, but what may be useful is just to look back and forth between existing chapter 123 and what's here, see if there are pieces you would like to pick up. But don't feel limited to what's done there. It should still be the question, where do you want money to go to? How do you want to prioritize particular pieces? I think you've largely resolved the rulemaking questions, but just spelling out this process as firmly as we can will move the draft. But it's up to you guys as to how you would like, what you would like the work product of the working group to be. It doesn't have to be a fully fleshed out chapter if you don't want it to be. If you would like to spend your time working through priorities, bonus incentives, you can do that. You don't have to make it look exactly like 123. So wherever you would like, where you think the hard decisions that are better made in this committee, then come session time, like that's probably where you want to be spending your time. And whether that facilitates my work or not, doesn't really matter. But
So what I see for the next meeting is if the teacher in me wants to give out homework, but I know Aaron, co-chair Brady would say, but no one ever does homework. So, but I'll give out some homework anyway, because I'm gonna do the homework and hopefully others will too. But it sounds as though, because I'm sort of winding things down here now, that we need, if possible, to take another look at 123 and this, sort of like do our own little side by sides and decide if there's anything else that we want in here that now exists in 123. Specifically 3448, but 123. And we need to, on page 10, think about 1 through 4. Correct, John? Engages robust community involvement, and whether we want to define those a little bit more clearly. Is that?
pull it up so everyone can see this.
Down at line 19, I think.
Or are we talking down at the bottom of the page, 19, 20, 21, all the way down?
Yeah, so all those at the very bottom, right?
Okay, so request for legislative appropriation, final approval. Okay,
I should say the request for legislative appropriation, we just talked about this particular request. I think that what you guys were suggesting was adding that the Agency of Education submit as part of the GovRec, its budget
Yes.
request. So that would cover what's in 4.
Okay.
And the reason I'm saying to look to 123 is just it's a template of what's done before. So it may be helpful for thinking about process, like what the process would be here, but you don't have to stick with these subdivisions. This is just the way that it's been done in the past with final approval, award of construction aid, what are eligible costs and payment.
yeah,
So, and as you'll note, we have it on page 11, the subdivision E rules. This is really already covered. We've set out that the Agency of Education is going to have responsibility to, or the authority to adopt rules. So that we can drop, but it's just facilitate the full process here.
yes, perfect. It's really great that you put those out there for us to really dig into. It's much appreciated. So looking into 123 and trying to see if there's anything else that we would like out of 123 to inform this work, but also really thinking about adding some meat to 4 through all that whole list there. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then B, C, D, E, and F. Thinking about what kind of language we want in the JFO special fund. Again, knowing that this is going to be looked at in our designated committees, but that we want to give some kind of a suggestion. And what else?
Were we gonna look at the current standards within the current state board and compare that to what we were thinking at the beginning of the bill? Was the rules to kind of give us Are we gonna look at that? Look at the current standards within the state board for school
Do you mean
construction?
looking at the rules that are in the 6600 series,
Yeah, the 6,000.
6,000 series?
Yeah, I thought we were gonna
I-
do some comparison there.
I thought that the idea had been that that was maybe a situation where deferring to their expertise, given limited time, makes
Yeah,
sense.
to make
Yeah,
it-
it's just,
Make a recommendation along that line.
Yeah,
apologies, my
left idea.
And did we decide on the advisory committee to be just advisory? And not do the gatekeeping?
I mean, I think that's gonna be part of the vote that we take at our next meeting.
Okay.
But it sounds that that is the direction that we're leaning toward. I can't speak for everybody, but
But then a review of the committee after a few, not a sunset, but maybe a review. We talked about that, right?
Doesn't the sunset force them to review it?
Yeah, but it's more of a hammer. And then I think Chris is the one that mentioned or bring too much unsettledness to the whole arena that maybe a review. No, direct sunset. I don't know, that's in the
You
education.
mentioned the unsettledness of it all, and
Yeah.
then I mentioned possibly a review.
so who's reviewing? Because I mean,
The legislature.
the legislature will review this in the
The
entire
establishment,
program.
the advisory board and its function.
How about what if we had like a check back with the legislature regarding this whole program every 5 years? Not just the advisory board, just to see like, how is it going, check-ins, and sorry, John.
So I was just gonna say, one of the duties that's currently set out for Agency of Education is annual reports on how the program is proceeding.
Nobody looks at.
Well, you can make a point of looking at it.
Yeah, I think we would do the wording and make sure that
Yeah,
that comes to the legislation to look at.
So just so this is one of the bullets I have that has a bunch of question marks around it. The board, for the next draft is meant to be advisory. It's not gonna have that first step in the rulemaking process, but it would make recommendations or submit written responses to the Agency of Education on rules. Is that the current concept? Or is it just rolling back to the advisory board as it existed prior to this draft, which did not have much to do with rulemaking? It's just advising on project priorities and the like.
I think from my point of view, there have to be a public meeting where folks who are interested are engaged in the process of the formal process of the AOE presenting rules to the board, have the board give their opinion. This is a great rule. This is why this one needs work and here's why. And it can be publicly done and in writing. But it needs to be some kind of a formal process, which we can lay that out.
So would it help our conversation and decision or not? If we had like a side by side in terms of what we're proposing for the powers and duties, what the agency does, and then what the advisory board does. If we had a side by side that laid out.
Is that meant to ensure that the responsibilities that the Agency of Education has align with those pieces that the board is advising on? I mean, it's.
Well, it's just, I mean, you can read the language here and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the responsibility of the agency? What's the responsibility of the board? How does that interact? How does it not interact? And I'm just wondering if we had a schematic. that-
Right. I'm just thinking if it rolls back to being purely advisory, then you could effectively say that the Agency of Education has all of the responsibilities that the board is advising on. What
Can I, sorry, John, sorry to interrupt.
Trying to think how to.
I mean, Bob, it might need to be tweaked, but you did share that cool flow chart
Mhm.
with me. I wonder is that something you might be able to pull up right now?
I mean, sometimes it's easier to see a picture than
Yeah,
it is to read the language to figure out where
Right.
everything lies.
Yeah.
Let me
Everybody
see what-
learns different.
Bob, if you can,
What's that?
if you can pop a link to that document in the chat, I can post it to the committee's page so that everyone. Okay, that's what I hear you asking for.
Okay, I gotta dig this up, so sorry for that. When did I send that to you, Martine? It was last
Oh,
week.
you know what, if we want to table that for next meeting, I can share it with Mike and, he can post it on the committee page, and I could just, but yeah, it was maybe a week or so ago.
Yeah,
So there is this cool flow chart they shared.
That might help us.
It might help, yeah,
Might help,
yeah.
have the big picture of how each piece interacts with each other.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so I'm gonna suggest that we, with the, advice and consent, now with, I want to make sure the folks who are helping us in all of this feel okay with us, pausing at this moment and meeting on the 25th to get to a final, hopefully get to a final product. And if we need to meet after that, it will be over Zoom. Is that okay with everyone? Okay. Okay, I know it'd be nice to be done, but I don't think we're quite there yet, so. Folks around the table? I think we're getting closer, we're getting closer. We're almost there.
We have enough direction for the next draft.
I feel like you have enough direction. for this?
I have a list of requests that I am happy to incorporate into the draft, and to the extent that discussion happens after this, like, let's please talk so that we can incorporate as much as we can, but kind of as I previewed, as I sat down, we'll achieve what we can with the time that we have, and I would just encourage the group to prioritize the pieces that they want most to have a say on, because there's a lot to this, and you could spend many more meetings talking about the whole process.
Yeah, so thanks, everyone. We have our sort of our work cut out for us for the next meeting, but I think it's relatively well defined. And we're gonna adjourn, and I just want to say thank you to everyone for